What's up, family? My name is Erin McCluskey. I'm an executive coach and I work with executives focusing on redefining individual definitions of success as well as learning ways to focus on wellness and connecting it to performance, both personally and professionally. So, welcome to Mini Bytes session 59. Yes, Mini Bytes session 59. And tonight's topic is who I am not. So, every time I do a Mini Bytes session, I take a few moments and just check in on where things are at, what messages are coming up, and what feels important to talk about. And tonight, again, I'm recording this a bit later in the evening for the second day. I had another long day of travel today. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about who I am not and how important this statement is and how important this phrase is for me to understand as I go about my life, this life experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. I can recall being given this book by a friend when I was living on the Big Island called I Am That. And it's a beautiful book. It's a profound book. And it's one of these books that you do not read from front to back. It's not a cover to cover type of a book. In fact, it generally took me, I would say, several weeks to, initially in particular, to get through even 2 to 3 pages. One of these books where you read two sentences and it sort of has you gasp for air as you reflect and try to integrate. I mean, it's just that profound. I would say it's certainly the most profound book I've read. And I've read a lot of good books along the way. So this book is called I Am That. And I can recall reading some of the pages in this book and arriving at a part where the individual who's being interviewed, that's how this book is set up, is talking about who they are not and how important it is for them to recognize who they are not before they can recognize who they are. And how I interpreted that statement and how I found that statement to be supportive was at the time I had just left the corporate sector and I left a company that I was with for almost 10 years. And I realized very quickly when I left that I really didn't know who I was. I realized very quickly when I left that I had identified so deeply with my role and the company that I worked for, which I was very proud to work for. I realized very quickly that I really didn't know who I was and I really didn't know what I was good at and I really didn't know what my gifts are and I didn't really know how to articulate them. And I can even recall going to lunch with an individual that is a dear friend of the founder of Medtronic. And at the lunch, he asked me, he said, well, what are your gifts? And I remember saying that I like to help people as one of my gifts. And he looked at me and he said, well, that's a nice thing, but is that really a gift? And it just sort of threw me for a loop at the time. I thought, well, maybe it's not a gift. And I recognize it is certainly a gift. However, in the corporate sector and in other professional aspects, it's important to be able to articulate what we're good at so that people know where they can use us and where we can be useful to companies and to teams and things like that. So leaving the company I was working for and not really knowing what to identify with and what I was good at, when I read this statement or when I read this about this statement in this book, I Am That, where it basically said, in order for us to know what we are, it's important for us to know what we are not. It absolutely opened this world of possibilities for me because I knew in a lot of ways what I was not at the time. And it was easier for me to start with thinking about the things that I was not. And the more I was able to think about the things I was not, the more I was able to eventually arrive at what I am. And I will say that this journey, this part of my journey has evolved in some really tremendous ways. It's a practice that is certainly evolving because it's not like, okay, well, I'm not these things, so I am these things. Actually, to even be able to state what I am not, it requires a certain amount of compassionate remembrance. Those of you who watch these videos, I've done sessions mini bites on compassionate remembrance and what that is. But very briefly, compassionate remembrance is the ability to remember to be compassionate toward myself. And so, in order to talk about what I am not, it does require a certain amount of compassionate remembrance, which, if I wasn't taught to do that, if I wasn't, if I'm generally hard on myself, or if I'm generally self-judging, it's going to be really difficult to demonstrate compassionate remembrance. But once that can happen, and once that did start to happen for me, it became easier for me to say, this is what I am not, be okay with that, and step into what I am. So really, just to wrap up, it is helpful sometimes, in particular those of us who are going through a transition, perhaps re-entering the workforce, or perhaps taking on a new career path, or perhaps starting a family, or perhaps getting married, or perhaps getting divorced. Might be an opportunity to think first, if we're having a hard time of thinking about, what am I good at? What can I do? Thinking about what I cannot do, and what I am not good at, and what I am not. And doing it from a place of love and compassionate remembrance, because guess what? We are not all things. None of us. We all have our gifts, and we have our things that we are, and we have our things that we are not. So I love you all. Until next time.